Talking about the Astonishing by Dream Theater is going to be a challenge, so let's jump right in. 2 hours, 10 minutes of music, their new album here in 2016. It is a rock opera, space opera, metal opera, whatever you want to call it. That is in 2 acts, and already I disagree. I already disagree because it actually feels like it's done in 5 acts or 5 parts, and those are separated or framed by 5 tracks out of the 34 total on this album. That are done by the Nomads, which are essentially the media or music makers, the machines of this dystopian world, this weird, strange society. So we have Descent of the Nomads, The Hovering Sojourn, Digital Discord, Machine Chatter, and Power Down that feel like they sort of separate one part from the next. That alone is enough to drive somebody crazy, but then we have the actual story itself, which we're not going to talk too much about because it's one that should be experienced by each listener. It's not necessarily a choose-your-own-adventure. This is not something that's down for philosophical debate. It's one that's very much like Game of Thrones or Star Wars by John Petrucci's own admittance, where it does have a storyline that can be followed. But we're here to talk principally about the music. So we begin with disc 1, which actually does a lot of things right. And there are going to be many people out there. I feel there's going to be a ton of detractors that feel that this album is so unlike anything Dream Theater that it has ever done that makes it a bad thing. That makes it a really poorly executed disc, completely ignoring the differences in Falling into Infinity, which already is seen as kind of a bummer album by some. But I like the fact that this is an album that they decided to handle very much like it is a play, something that is meant to be on the stage, either that or a full-length movie, which I actually would sort of imagine as being animated, or a video game, which again, by John Petrucci's own admittance, is kind of what he envisioned this to be. So we get a lot of conflict with disc 1. We get a lot of introduction, not only to the world that surrounds these people, but also to the concepts and to the conflict that really also surrounds them. We see the 2 different sides that have been teased to us for so very long on the Dream Theater website. We see the Ravenskill revolution that is slowly but surely starting to take place. They want to go up against the Empire, and we're introduced to characters such as Lord Nefarious or Gabriel, either that or Faith. There are more. There is just so much to digest here. And the music itself is definitely something that is going to be fair whenever it comes to having some of these criticisms made, because it is one that is very story-driven and one that is extremely narrative-heavy. It's instead of being just a lavish, 13-minute long piece of music that's meant to chronicle one section of the story, we're instead getting this in tiny chunks, with the longest song on this album running at about 7.5 minutes. And the music is a blend between really classic prog rock with a lot of storytelling aspects. I listen and I hear a lot of bands such as Vandenplas or Kansas or Marillion that's really in the mix here. So there's a 70s style, an 80s style, and even a late 90s, 2000s style that really incorporate itself and sort of piece together this entire puzzle. And it's very lavish. The gift of music is one that sets up essentially the world following Dystopian Overture, and then we slowly start to learn that this is a place where music is very artificial. It's not something that there was that line that nobody has the time for music anymore is not only philosophical to the current age that we live in, even though we have more music than ever before. A lot of it does feel very plastic. But it's one where in this world, this is a principal problem, a huge conflict, one that actually has become one of the building blocks for a revolution. Now we swirl here between a lot of keyboards. There's a lot of keys and a lot of ambiance that really is able to piece itself together alongside John's steady hand on the guitars and James's fluctuation of vocals. And that's absolutely key for this, because if there's one criticism that can be had about Operation Mindcrime by Queensryche is the fact that sometimes identity of character is not always blatantly obvious. And James does his best to try to change things up a little bit to indicate the motives of the character through his voice, and does a fairly decent job on this, though confusion can still occur. But that's okay. It's instead something where it's setting up the plot, it's actually building a lot of suspense. But if there's one critique that I certainly have for Act 1 is the fact that I feel that a couple of these chunks could have easily been handled in a combined effort. And I'm looking especially at songs such as Chosen and A Tempting Offer, which easily could have been combined together. We could have had a couple of 10-minute songs that really indicate a wider swath of the plot and could have gotten the job done with the same element of suspense, with the same element of surprise, even though this album is essentially a movie's worth of music. You can call it a 2-hour song if you really wanted to. This is just something that probably would have made the flow a little bit more manageable, because 20 tracks is something that a lot of people look at not as a challenge, but as a fear-inducing point. It's way too much to digest, and it takes a lot to do so. I love the fact, though, that A New Beginning, right there, track 19, right before you get to the finale of disc 1, you have probably the most magical song on this album. This is the one where Dream Theater fans of old should really feel very comfortable with this treasure. It's one that showcases their elder side with a lot more precision, and it is able to continue the thematic elements that are being displayed throughout Act 1. Even if it's something as simple as a couple of notes or a familiar tone, there is something that haunts your register, your mental register, as very familiar, tying everything together almost as though delivering a present, and it's very nicely done. I love this track. I can't recommend this song enough. It is fantastic, and it's also one of the very few tracks where John just shreds and just goes to town for about 4 minutes, and it is a wonderful experience. Not everybody likes it whenever one of the members of this band just goes off on a long, an elongated guitar tangent, but this is a track where it's not only necessary, but it's well executed. Moving into Act 2, this is one that showcases way more conflict, principally because the revolution has begun. The primary directive of this album, showcasing the battle, showcasing how these two sides converge and come together and basically fight for what they believe in, is all over Act 2, and it is one that is well done. I would say that Act 2 probably does a little bit more than Act 1, not only because it handles things in a little bit of a shorter engagement, but also because it just feels like this is a little bit more complete, and it has a lot of the aggressive side that one corner of Dream Theater's fans will really be clamoring for, while still maintaining the emotional side. There is balance here, whereas with Act 1, with all of the conflict being set up and with all of the introductions and the forlorn, we're not allowed to talk, Romeo and Juliet ideal that is present there. Just listen and you'll understand it. It actually causes a little bit more of a teetering toward a softer element that is only spattered about with a little bit of aggressiveness here and there. That one has a lot more of the musical theater exercise really pinned down to it. Disc 2 feels a lot more geared toward a little bit more aggression, conflict resolution, as well as just Dream Theater doing their best to create a battle with their own unique musical identity, and does so quite well. On this, once again, it is a song near the end that really shows itself as the grand champion of the disc, and that's Our New World. This is a fantastic track that is able to really give a fitting finale, I guess, to this whole idea, but at the same time, it's one of those majestic moments, almost like at the end of any action film or any film about a battle, where you see the victorious side sort of looking out at what has been created based around what they have done. Consider the end of Lord of the Rings, and this is probably about 10 times as lavish, principally because it feels and seems like this is being monitored or spectated from the battlefield itself, as opposed to many months later, although I'm probably wrong in that assessment. We have one final piece, which is the powering down sequence of the Nomax, showcasing the victory for the revolution, and then Astonishing, which feels very much like the pan to the New World that was described with Our New World, and then finally a credit sequence. Wow! On a musical scale, this is one that certainly blends the lines between progressive rock and progressive metal, and even showcases other elements such as 80s rock. There's some 80s rock and roll riffs on here that are able to make themselves known, which feel right at home with some of the 80s prog rock. There's elements of Rush, of Kansas, of Marillion, as I said once before. And there is still an identity that Dream Theater is able to manifest throughout all of this that harkens back to the idea of musical theater, that harkens back to the idea of just great showmanship. but there are flaws. There are flaws on this disc. It sounds like for the past 10 minutes that this is an instant 100 out of 100, and it is not. So what are the flaws? At times the storytelling can be a little bit, and I mean a little bit, by a little bit, it can be a little bit hokey. It's one where it seems like trying to push the story to where they wanted to take it involved taking some shortcuts and not so much liberties, but just sort of going the easy route with some of the lyricism. And I understand that whenever you tell a story, sometimes simple lyrics, simple words, simple phrases, and simple paragraphs are a part of any narrative, but a couple of these felt as though they were being done in that way just to sort of get the rhyme there, as opposed to being willing to go with something a little more disjointed to make it feel a little bit more natural. Now that's a really small, that's small potatoes. But I also feel that the dismissal of the idea of having long tracks on this album to help fuse the narrative together was actually more of a mistake than actually a help. And this is just a personal opinion. This really isn't one that is really geared toward any sort of truth or falsehood. It's completely and totally subjective as opposed to objective. I feel that this is one that could have easily been handled in a similar style as there's a Tesseract album that did things in a couple of different acts, and I think that would have been a really nice way to handle this narrative, especially whenever it comes to some of the pieces that all feel very connected, but they just feel like different parts of a battle. Like, I have a multiple part idea to really close this out, a huge suite to finish out Act 2. Although, once again, as I stated earlier, the whole thing could easily be seen as a 2-hour and 10-minute long song. Aside from that, musically, it does bear a lot of themology, but at times it even can seem a bit hokey, either that or a little bit simplistic. The overusage of ballading and the overusage of softer themes is going to be seen as a critical point to a lot of fans. I feel like they're going to not exactly be able to stay with the message and stay with the story as easily because they get hyped up for so long, and then it just feels like it goes down a notch for a little bit too long to follow it up, almost as though the balance on this album is just off by a little bit in some locations. But other than that, it's really hard to argue with this album because it's very well executed. It is a lavish, huge idea that somehow Dream Theater was able to pull off and do so very well. It's an album that's going to transform a lot of people and give them a memory for many years to come. For others, though, this is going to be seen as a true division point, and that's kind of where my fear lies. For myself personally, it has a lot of great credibility to it, not to mention the story itself is one that feels kind of cool. I like the way in which the story is set up, and I would love to see it brought to life. And also, I sort of wish that instead of trying to just destroy us with all of this at once, that the band may have opted to maybe give this in 2 albums, like it is a double album after all, but I'm talking 2 separate releases where you had to wait for the other half to see how the story sort of ended up. I know that would have probably pissed a lot of people off, but I think that would have been really neat, and I think there's still a lot of elements of this universe that Petrucci and the rest of Dream Theater can really draw on for potential future releases. And I don't necessarily mean full albums. I also mean that they could easily use the Rush idea and just have some of these characters once again spoken about on future releases. Overall, this is a disc that is a lot to digest. It can sometimes be a bit difficult to digest, and I know that many casual fans are going to find this to be perhaps the penultimate challenge of their music listening career. It's going to be rough. I mean, Swallow the Sun released a triple album last year, and that was actually a lot easier to swallow and a lot easier to listen to than this album at times is. But that being said, it is still a tremendous work, one that really blends the idea of progressive music and musical theater and stage work to new elements, to new heights. This actually takes that concept to the logical next step, and perhaps to the logical final step, where they might as well just write the damned play. 90 out of 100. As I said, this does have some flaws on it, but aside from that, this is a masterfully executed album, a very big risk, but if there's any band that can handle this risk and somehow come out of it smelling like roses and their farts smelling like daisies, it's Dream Theater, and they did it. What did you think about the Astonishing by Dream Theater, though? I want to know. Whew. It's also a grower of an album, I'm going to say that, because the first time I listened to this, the score is a little lower. But each subsequent listen has just made it better and better. It's a really cool album. You know, that's just real talk right there. But I'm winded. I'm tired. What did you think about this album? Let me know in the comments below. I'm coverkillernation. And I think a lot of you are going to be astonished by this. I think that's a pretty good A word. Amazing is another good one. But I know which A word I am. And, well, Dennis Leary famously sung a song about it. You know, ASSHOLE. Bye.